Well, hello again. This is the fifth class out of 9 where we're seeking to benefit from a study in Ecclesiastes. One of the things that I really appreciate about Solomon is his honesty. He's been arguing that if a person lives and works hard within a purely materialistic and temporal frame of reference, where he doesn't acknowledge God and to say nothing about fearing God, don't admit their dependence upon God and are not submitting to the authority of God as Lord and King, that if they're truly honest with themselves, they're going to realize that everything they've done and that everything they're doing in life is futile and meaningless, at least in the end. And like Solomon, this secular person that's leaving God's will out of the picture, if they slow down and reflect and sober up perhaps and allow themselves to reflect on reality, they're going to end up hating life, at least possibly, hating life and struggling with despair. We read because this is what Solomon confesses that he felt at times. We read in Ecclesiastes 2, starting in verse 17. Solomon says, "So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after wind. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. So I turned about, gave my heart up to despair." So that's what we've been looking at in the last few weeks, which hasn't been very encouraging and positive. But today we come to a significant turning point, starting in the end of chapter 2 and verse 24. We'll read that in a minute. But in this section, which is chapter 2, 24 to the end of chapter 3, Solomon is giving an alternative to this pessimism. And the alternative is faith in God, as we well know. And there's at least 3 good reasons to view this section as a turning point. I'm going to put them on the screen. So let me give you 3 reasons. The first is that up till now, God has been scarcely mentioned. He was mentioned in chapter 1:13, but this one time, he's not seen as the answer to man's struggles, but as the one from which they actually come. We read in verse 13, chapter 1, "It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of men to be busy with." Now, of course, Solomon is referring to God's response to man's original sin. As Paul wrote in Romans 8, "For the creation," Paul writes, "was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it." That's God. "For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who are the first fruits of the Spirit, we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies." So Solomon is addressing that God is the source of a lot of what man struggles with as a result of the curse that he put on all of creation due to man's sin. But now in this section that we're going to be looking at this morning, at least beginning today, and then we'll go further into it next week, God is presented as the one who is the source of wisdom and knowledge and joy. God is presented as the just governor of both sinners and righteous. And he controls the entire universe. And it is God whose providential control results in what is beautiful. And so God is presented in a very different way. Number 2, a second reason why I think this is a turning point. Wisdom is not presented as something man acquires or doesn't acquire on his own. Now note the difference between 2 verses in chapter 1:16 and 2:26. In 1:16 it says, "I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. Now in 2:26, we read, for to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. And then we also see in chapter 2:21 that wisdom and knowledge are in company with skill, yet they're viewed as failing in the face of death. In 2:21 it says, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. But now in this passage we're looking at this morning, in verse 26, wisdom and knowledge are found in the company with joy, and they are considered a blessing. In verse 26, to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. Well, there's also a third reason this section could be seen as a turning point. It is up till now, this is number 3, up till now, the perspective has been pretty much nihilistic. Creation, history, life, and death all lead to despair and to anguish. There's no reference to beauty or joy or justice. But now, moving forward, at least for the next bit, Solomon is going to make reference to enjoyment and to beauty and to God's gifts, and to divine purpose and joy, even in the face of injustice. So we are at a turning point in Solomon's presentation of man's search for meaning in life here under the sun. As one author wrote, having exposed the bankruptcy of our supposed autonomy, the preacher now points to the God who occupies the heavenly realm and to the life of faith in him. He now points to the God who occupies the heavenly realm and to the life of faith in him. All right, let me go ahead and read verses 24 to 26 of chapter 2. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, apart from God, who can eat? Or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give it to the one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. All right, in verse 24, Solomon is turning from nihilism to present what is basically an orthodox Jewish view of creation, of the creation realm. And namely, it's this, that despite its brokenness, creation is essentially good. And God has created it to provide sustenance and enjoyment for us, as well as the whole animal kingdom. That's the Jewish Old Testament biblical view of creation. For example, and there's many examples, but for example, in Psalm 104, it's a psalm that praises God as the good and gracious creator. Let's read a few verses from that. You make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field, and wild donkeys quench their thirst. Beside them the birds of the heavens dwell. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. You cause the grass to grow for the livestock, and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. In them the birds build their nests. The stork has her home in the fir trees. The high mountains are for the wild goats. The rocks are a refuge for the rock badgers. The young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. When the sun rises, they steal away and lie down in their dens. Man goes out to his work and to labor until the evening. O Lord, how manifold are your works! In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. Well, to be honest with you, I find that to be quite beautiful. It's a biblical view of this special planet that God has placed us on. No wonder God gave the task to Adam, the prototypical human, the original man that God created. He gave him this task to cultivate and to take care of the garden in which God had placed him. Now, although we as Christians do not worship Mother Earth, we take our stewardship responsibility for this planet very seriously. And we ask God for wisdom and how best to do that. Now, we oppose, as Christians, this left-wing hysteria. We refuse to equalize animal rights with human rights. But we also stand against the destruction of God's world in order to feed human greed. But this is a digression. We need to move on. The biblical view, the biblical worldview that teaches that God created the world to be the source for our sustenance and a vehicle for our enjoyment. And in Ecclesiastes, Solomon will write, we're going to see, I'll put it on the screen, that there is nothing better than, 4 different times. Look at where he says this. There is nothing better than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. There is nothing better than to be joyful and to do good. Chapter 3:12. There's nothing better than to rejoice in his work. Verse 22, chapter 3. There's nothing better than to eat and drink and be joyful. So he is affirming that there is a higher good, that there's no higher good in this life. There's no better way to pass along the road of life while living under the sun than to live with what we might call purposeful contentment. In other words, we should consciously and mindfully embrace the joy of the simple pleasures in everyday life and in the world around us. We need to accept with gratitude and thankfulness to God, being ever mindful that all of these things flow from his grace. Again, in verse 24 of chapter 2, flowing into verse 25, this also I saw is from the hand of God, for apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? To accept these good, simple pleasures of life, eating and drinking and finding enjoyment in our toil, as coming from God. So with gratitude and thankfulness to God, we embrace these pleasures and we find this joy. Well, I do want to draw your attention to this issue of find enjoyment in his toil that Solomon talks about. Literally, and if you have an ESV Bible in the margin, it says, make his soul see good in his toil. Make his soul see good in his toil. So what is this find enjoyment and make my soul see good? Well, I think it brings up a very important principle. And that is, it is important to understand, or to be reminded, that happiness is a choice. Happiness should not be viewed as an emotion that just happens or doesn't happen, based on our circumstances. No, I don't think we should be passive. Solomon uses active words like find enjoyment in your toil. Make your soul see good. One of the podcasts that I subscribe to is called Pragertopia, and I would highly recommend it. It lets me listen to the daily talk show of Dennis Prager, but it strips away all the commercials. Now, Prager has a huge audience. He's a conservative Jewish talk show host, an author and conference speaker. And I highly recommend any of these, I think there's over 400 now, 5-minute educational videos on PragerU.com. It's a website, PragerU.com. Over 4.6 billion views at this point. So I encourage you to check it out and watch some of the videos, confirm whether you think it's worth it. You might want to introduce this site to your children or to your grandchildren, especially if they're in the public school system. And by the way, if in light of, this is a little digression, but in light of the times in which we're living, if you send me an email, I'll give you some suggestions about podcasts and websites that will keep you up on a biblical worldview of what's happening in our day. But for our purposes this morning, the reason I'm even bringing this up is because back in 1998, Prager wrote a book entitled Happiness is a Serious Problem. Let me read a short blurb talking about that book. In his book, Happiness is a Serious Problem, Prager argues that achieving happiness requires a continuing process of counting your blessings and giving up expectations that life is supposed to be wonderful. Can we decide to be satisfied with what we have? He asks. A poor man who can make himself satisfied with his portion will be happier than a wealthy man who does not allow himself to be satisfied. Prager argues that too many people today see themselves as victims. He submits that the only way to achieve your desires is to take responsibility for your life rather than blaming others. Anyway, for what it's worth, I thought I'd mention this book because I do think it correlates with what Solomon is saying when he says, make your soul see good in your toil. Now, as with all of life, there's an interplay between human responsibility, find enjoyment in your toil, Solomon is saying, between human responsibility and God's sovereignty and sovereign control and providence. So again, in 24b to 25, this also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? Well, as I mentioned earlier, this is why the attitude of gratitude is so important. Because it reveals that I understand that the joy and contentment and happiness that I am choosing to find and experience through the everyday good things in my life are ultimately due to the sovereign grace of God. So despite what every commercial on television is preaching, I do not deserve to be happy. My sin has not earned me the right to happiness. It's earned me judgment. But thanks to God, his grace makes joy and happiness possible. But it's his grace. And as I pursue enjoyment in life, in toil, in creation around me, in the beauty of the day, in the beauty of the mountains, let's remember continuously to express our gratitude and thankfulness to God, because it's his grace that enables us to enjoy these things. Well, in verse 26, we read, for to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to the one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. All right, this phrase, to the one who pleases him. I want to ask the question, who is that? Who pleases God? And what comes to mind is the passage in Hebrews 11, verse 6, where we read, and without faith, it is impossible to please him, to please God. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So the one who pleases God is the one who trusts God enough to draw near to him through repentant faith that expresses itself in obedience, believing he exists and that he rewards. So who is the one who pleases God? The one who receives wisdom and knowledge and joy? Well, it's the one who trusts God enough to draw near to him. You draw near to him through repentant faith that expresses itself in obedience. And we believe that God exists and that he rewards. Who's the sinner? Well, the sinner is, we're all sinners, in reality. But who Solomon's talking about is a person who does not trust, is not concerned with pleasing God. Solomon says God gives him the business or the task of gathering and collecting. So the person in verse 24, where we read there is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment. That person is identified in verse 26 as the one who pleases God, because it's to this person that God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy. A great British pastor and commentator back in the 1600s, Matthew Henry, writes the following. Riches, in other words, food, drink, gainful employment, are a blessing or a curse to a man according as he has or has not a heart to make good use of them. God makes them a reward to a good man, if with them he gives him wisdom and knowledge and joy, to enjoy them cheerfully himself, and to communicate them charitably to others. Ungodliness is commonly punished with discontent and an insatiable covetousness, which are sins that are their own punishment. So the sinner is commonly punished with discontent and an insatiable covetousness, which are sins that are their own punishment in and of themselves, Matthew writes. But, of course, that's not all. Solomon is saying more in verse 26. What has been gathered and collected ends up being given to the one who pleases God. This principle also comes up in Proverbs. For example, in chapter 13, verse 22, we read, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the sinner's wealth is laid up for the righteous." If we were to ask, how does that happen? We're actually not told in Ecclesiastes. In fact, Solomon is soon going to write that he's going to write about injustice and oppression towards good people, against those that are not good, is what, is often the experience in life. But we do have countless examples of God giving the accumulated prosperity of the secular rich to his people. For example, in the Old Testament, the Canaanites had built houses and cities, and they had planted vineyards and cleared and cultivated land and dug the wells, and God's people ended up acquiring it and living off of it and enjoying it. We read in Deuteronomy 6, 10 to 11, "And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns or wells that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. And when you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord." Torchbearers, the ministry that Roxy and I were involved with for almost 20 years, owns and enjoys many properties around the world that were built by people who had no interest in God. And there are incredible stories behind each of these acquisitions that would just blow your mind about how God, turned over these properties at far less than their actual worth to the ministry of torchbearers. And let me show you just a few examples. Okay, here's Ravencrest Chalet, where Roxy and I ministered for a number of years. And then there's Cape and Ray Hall over in England on the Lakes District. And then this is called Cape and Ray Harbor, so on Thetis Island, between Vancouver Island and Victoria. And then Klostermüller in Germany, a German language school. And then, of course, the Navigator Castle, Glen Erie, there in Colorado as well. Well, dear friends, in closing, I'm going to do something a little different. I have written pages more that I was going to talk with you about this morning as we move into chapter 3, which talks about, there's a time for everything, that God has ordained, actually, a time for everything. And we have this whole list here at the beginning of chapter 3. But we're going to do that next week. It came to my attention while I was working on this material that Dr. John Piper had just released a podcast that speaks exactly to what is before us. So we're going to listen to the latest. It's a Ask Pastor John podcast from Desiring God Ministries. And the title of this particular podcast is Everything Made Meaningful. It's about 10 minutes. So let's listen to Pastor John Piper as he talks about God's providence and one of the benefits of it, knowing that everything can be meaningful.
Tony, it seems to me that over the years, many of the folks that have written to us have wrestled with the basic meaningfulness or significance of life and of reality, sometimes because of the suffering that they walk through, sometimes because of the simple, banal, repetitive, seemingly meaningless, mundane routines of life. And so this particular effect that I'm going to talk about now of understanding and cherishing the all-embracing, all-pervading providence of God might land on those people, as it does on me, with great preciousness and great significance. And the third effect of seeing and savoring this providence of God is this: it establishes a framework of reality in our mind by which we see absolutely everything in the universe, from the smallest to the greatest, as a part of God's meaningful design. In other words, when we look at everything through the lens of God's providence, everything is significant. Everything is meaningful. Nothing is random. Nothing is pointless. Nothing is meaningless. Everything, absolutely everything, is from God and through God and to God. Therefore, he says, to God be glory forever and ever. In other words, everything has its origin in the absolute existence and wisdom and goodness of God. And everything is guided through the infinite wisdom of God. And everything is moving toward the greatest possible goal imaginable, namely the fullest display of the panorama of God's perfections, which we call the glory of God. Everything in some way fits in to this infinitely wise plan. Nothing is meaningless. Every thread in the tapestry of reality is being woven by God into a depiction of the glory of God. Some threads in this tapestry are radiant in and of themselves with bright significance. Other threads in themselves are dark with mysterious twists and textures and shades of bloody crimson. Sometimes God gives us glimpses of the final depiction of his beauty in all things, and it just takes our breath away. But other times, our vision is limited to the underside of the tapestry with its inexplicable tangles and textures and colors. At those times, when providence seems most confusing, we must open our Bibles and listen to the interpretations of God and direct our hearts to the strong affirmations that God has given us with Christ at the center, that he's wise, he's good, he's just, and he is at work in and through all things. Nothing is meaningless. Nothing is random. Nothing. Not the greatest evils, not the greatest cruelties. None of them is owing ultimately to God's supposed weakness or wickedness or ignorance or demonic competition. The dice are rolled in 1,000 casinos, and every decision is from the Lord. Proverbs 16:33. As R.C. Sproul used to say, there are no maverick molecules. Indeed, there are no maverick athletes or actors or singers or presidents or scholars or street people. I look at the leaves waving on the tree outside my study, and I believe that every motion of every leaf of every tree in the world is waving in accord with God's guidance and plan. I look at the 10,000 tiny bubbles popping at the top of the foam of my Diet Dr. Pepper as the foam goes away after being poured. And I believe that every one of those bubbles is popping in accord perfectly with God's bubble popping plan. And that does not tax the divine mind at all. I look at history, the history of nations, through the lens of the prophet Daniel. I see Assyria has passed away, Babylon has passed away, Persia has passed away, Greece has passed away, the Roman Empire has passed away, China will pass away, America will pass away, all the Western nations will pass away, because it is God who changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He brings princes to nothing and makes the rulers of the earth as emptiness. So, from the smallest reality, a leaf waving, a bubble popping, to the greatest realities of nations and galaxies, everything is shot through with God-designed meaning. Where this is denied and God is eliminated from that process, all knowledge is enveloped in a cloud of folly and meaninglessness. Where it is affirmed, the possibilities of profound, amazing, beautiful, and helpful insights and enjoyments abound. This is a precious, soul-strengthening, faith-sustaining, life-steadying, joy-deepening vision of reality. It is precious beyond measure to see the world under God this way. Perhaps I could just close by letting my old literature professor from Wheaton College days 50 years ago bear witness to the mental health that such a vision brings into human experience. In 1976, Clyde Kilby, the great lover and scholar and advocate for the writings of C.S. Lewis back when hardly anybody was talking about C.S. Lewis, came to Minneapolis and gave a talk about his experience with literature and life. He closed that talk with what he called means to mental health. There were 11 of them. You can read them at Desiring God. I'm going to close with 2 of them. Here's number 2. Quote, "Instead of the accustomed idea of a mindless and endless evolutionary change to which we can neither add nor subtract, I shall suppose the universe guided by an intelligence which, as Aristotle said of Greek drama, requires a beginning, a middle, and an end. I think this will save me from the cynicism expressed by Bertrand Russell before his death when he said, 'There is darkness without, and when I die there will be darkness within. There is no splendor, no vastness anywhere, only triviality for a moment, and then nothing.'" And number 11, quote, "Even if I turn out to be wrong, I shall bet my life on the assumption that this world is not idiotic, neither run by an absentee landlord, but that today, this very day, some stroke is being added to the cosmic canvas that in due course I shall understand with joy as a stroke made by the architect who calls himself Alpha and Omega." Dear Dr. Kilby, you are in heaven now, and I still love you. What you showed me is immeasurably valuable. You did not turn out to be wrong. This great vision of God's providence, God's purposeful sovereignty in all things, kept you healthy and happy and brought you home. And so it will do for all of us who see and savor God's all-embracing providence with Jesus Christ at the center.
All right. I hope that God will minister that to your hearts, and it might be worth listening to it a second time, even a third time. There's a lot there. But let me close in a word of prayer. Lord, thank you again for this time we've had in your word. Thank you, Lord, that you've given us a world that, although it's broken, Lord, and there's much struggle, yet, Lord, we can find joy in the occupations you've given us and in the world around us and the simple things of life. Help us to be mindful of the joy that is possible through what you've given us, Lord, to have attitudes of gratitude. Lord, thank you that you are in control of everything. There's mystery here. There's no doubt. There's mystery. But Lord, even the good, the bad, the ugly, it's all within your sovereign control. And you are painting, weaving this beautiful, huge, panoramic fresco, we might say, that in the end will glorify you. And so, Lord, as we live in one little space of it, in one little spot, things can look dark. And yet by faith, we know and we believe that when it's all put together, it will be beautiful and it will glorify you. So help us, Lord, to continue to live by faith and to look forward to that day when we will see as you see and praise you for all you've done. In your name, amen.